Okay, good morning. All right. This is going to be an interesting talk because it's not about software, and it's not about process, and it's not about organizations. It's about all of that stuff, right? It's interesting to think about our goals in life, and I think one early goal I had, I don't know how I got this as a kid, is to try to understand everything. So I just enjoy digging into things. As a kid, I read voraciously. Some of the best conversations I've ever had with people have been all about this thing of trying to understand things. And when you do that, after a while, you basically accumulate so many different perspectives of the world that every once in a while you run into something and you say, wow, that's kind of funny. What does that really mean? Why is this happening? Is it really the right path? Stuff along those lines. And recently, I guess maybe it was about 2015 or so, I was getting myself set up to go to the Agile conference in Washington, D.C. And this is kind of odd for me because I hadn't gone in years. And the reason I hadn't really gone is because I had been there from the very beginning, and at a certain point you start feeling like I've kind of heard these things before, and it's great people are getting into this, but you know, I need different headspace. I need to be in a different place in terms of what I'm thinking about. And the other thing, though, was like this background irritation, and that background irritation was really all about the fact that for 10 years, people had been talking about scaling Agile, right? And there was never any dearth of approaches to do this, but they've kind of like, you know, they're settling on different things now, and you know, we're taking this very small process that started out with like, you know, teams of 10 to 12 people and saying, okay, we're going to go and spread this out and basically make this big for giant organizations and such like this. So we have scaled Agile, we have the Spotify model, all these different things that people have like happened upon over the years in order to go and sort of organize your organization in order to go and actually make this kind of stuff work. And you know, it gets to be a little bit of a jumble. It's like you see all these different frameworks, and it's like somebody who's new to the industry, they're thinking like, gee, you know, how do I pick from all these different things? And moreover, it was just really striking to me because, as I mentioned, I got involved in this extremely early. And you know, just noticed that, you know, when all this stuff started out, it was about solving a local problem, a single team that was not able to go and really deliver within the context of an organization happened to be in. And you know, what do we put in place to make this happen? You had pioneers like Kent Beck and Ken Schwaber walking in and basically saying, look, here's some stuff for us to try to go and sort of fashion a way to get business and development to work together to basically just deliver software. But almost immediately, we get to this thing of like, yay, I have a small team delivering. How do I make this work across my entire organization, right? And it's funny about that, though, because I always like to ask myself first with something like that, it's like, what makes us think it's going to work, right? What makes us think that this particular thing that works locally is meant to even scale to this higher level, right? Now, we can look at this and say, well, you know, of course, we've had plenty of success since then. You know, we have things like the Spotify model, we have the LESS framework, we have scaled Agile, we have all these different things that people are using, and they're using them quite productively. But I know that in the back of my mind, you know, I visit large organizations and small organizations. I've always got a special place in my heart for the small organizations. Those seem to be like little communities, and yes, some things can be a little bit dysfunctional, but quite often they aren't, and they tend to be nice places to work and with minimal bureaucracy and things along these lines. But still, you get to that thing of like, why did we just assume that this thing that works for 6 to 12 people was going to work for all of these people, right? And if we do end up making something which is kind of like that small thing that works for all these different people, is it really the same thing, or is it something different entirely, right? So scaling is a big deal, and the thing is, usually when people hear scaling, they think of, you know, architecture, they think of performance, throughput, you know, scaling in your market, all these different things. Recently, we've gone through this giant, you know, path of moving from monoliths to microservices, you know, within the context of the industry. And this is right, you know, it's a pretty good direction. I'm not saying it's definitely not for everybody, right? And it's like there are alternatives on the horizon, things people are trying out. But it's interesting as well to kind of notice that, you know, you start with one architectural vision, you grow it, you grow it, you grow it, you have this giant program, and then suddenly you figure out that as you scale, that's not the right structure for what we have, for what we need to do, right? But it's kind of odd because nobody ever really seems to see that coming, right? They think, well, you know, our job now is to go and sort of make something that's going to go and sort of like serve this many users. And then later on, it's kind of like, well, of course, we can do larger numbers of users. So we just have to go and sort of like bolster it up. It's like the same structure is going to work for us. And it doesn't necessarily. But it seems like we're surprised by this over and over again. So many people have basically taken monoliths to services or microservices. Yeah, quite a few, right? It's just a thing that tends to happen within the industry. And in fact, actually I would go and sort of make the argument that you don't always have to go down that path, but we ought to have like almost like a systems life cycle type, view of the world and saying, okay, well, you start this way and then you end up over here possibly, or you can end up over here, or you can end up over here. And you may not be able to go and actually massage the path in such a way that the transition is necessarily easy, because it may be a vastly different structure, but kind of knowing that the better structure at scale is something you're probably going to confront at some point in time can probably help you make better choices as you go forward with things. So more on scaling. Anybody ever watched like old 1950s sci-fi? And we still do it today, don't we? Giant insects, right? And it's like, they're cool, right? I'd love to see, sometime in my life, I'd love to see a 30-foot high ant. It'd be great, yeah, I'd run away, but that's just the way things are, right? But it's fascinating, but it's also like this same thing. There is this belief that we can actually have a 30-foot tall ant, can we? You talk to biologists and they say no, right? And one of the earliest places where this was kind of recorded, there's this guy named Haldane, and he wrote an essay back in the 1920s, and he was talking about in biology that certain structural organizations simply can't work at different scales. And so you can't sort of like say, let's make a 30-foot tall ant. For, basically the whole issue of having an exoskeleton versus an endoskeleton falls apart in the face of physics, and things like respiration and all these other things. But still, it's cool, and we like to think about that giant ant, but it doesn't really tend to work out that way. The bigger question then beyond that is like, what does that mean in terms of other systems? We've just talked about software architecture, we've talked about process. You can even look at governance, for instance, and go and say, look, is there an appropriate size for a group of people to be able to govern themselves, right? And that's kind of an interesting thing to go and consider as well. In the United States, for instance, I think we have fundamentally the same structure we had from the very beginning, and I forget what the actual numbers are, but the number of people represented by, say, a representative in a representative government has gone from like this to like this. And it's like, okay, that's good, but do we have side effects as a result of this? Should we structure things in a different way? But again, we have that assumption that essentially the structure we have is going to be the best structure under scale. And that's kind of awkward. So digging into this sort of thing, I always have these kind of questions in my background processing as I'm thinking about other things across, the industry and everything else. But I kind of wonder, can anything at all scale without different structure, Is this something that we should be surprised by? And furthermore, how does structure actually grow? So I don't know, God, how many years ago was this that Edward Snowden came out with his revelations about what was happening with surveillance in the US and around the world? 5 years ago or something like that? Yeah. And that kind of struck me rather hard because I'd heard, I know some people, and I'd heard various things that seemed like they were plausible, and it's like, yeah. And then suddenly this comes out and it's like, oh man, all this stuff is true, right? In terms of what can actually be intercepted in terms of communication across every place, right? And the thing about this is that immediately, as soon as people hear about this, if they care, the first thing they say is like decentralization, decentralization, decentralization. How do we actually sort of set things up in such a way that you have less, you have more local control, and you have less possibility of intercepted communication and all these other things. The thing which basically makes surveillance very easy across the internet is essentially the existence of trunks, right? And the existence of, like the backbone, the internet backbone. And so, there is physical infrastructure across the world that basically goes in, helps in the routing messages all over the place. And there are certain points that are extremely hot. They are places where you have, tens of millions of, messages per second coming through, all this stuff, and packets. And, I guess it doesn't really take very much to go and actually like tap into those, and it's like, yay, here's a place where we can intercept lots and lots of communication. So, well, there's two questions. One is, how do you get past it? But I guess the first question is, why is it that way? Is that faulty engineering? To go and sort of like route everything through like these funnels to go and get to someplace else. When you think about it, this is kind of like how an ISP operates, right? Essentially, you sign up with an ISP, you go to the ISP, all your traffic and all the people that go through the ISP go through those things, it's federated and it goes through across all these things. And if you were to look at this from a security point of view, one of the things you'd say is, gee, a way more secure way of doing this stuff is point to point. You can actually say, look, if I want to talk to Mike, I need a direct line of sight and a laser beam that's going to go from my phone to his phone, and then we can talk, and it's like the only way you can intercept my message is by standing there with a mirror and doing something to go and sort of intercept it. But that's wildly impractical. Line of sight doesn't work for everything. And it's also extremely expensive, in terms of energy and all these other things. Other ways around this problem, one is to go and basically use mesh networks, where you can essentially say, look, I'm kind of putting this message out there. I kind of know where it needs to go, and basically it goes to my neighbor, and from my neighbor to other neighbors, and it gets spread around and kind of like floods the network and eventually ends up where you need to be. So why aren't we using those two solutions, line of sight and mesh? It's expensive, right? It's expensive to do this kind of stuff. And that's an interesting thing to kind of notice, is that there is an expense to going and actually sort of like saying, look, let's not have these pinch points across an entire network. I saw this on Hacker News the other day. Somebody going and making a nice mesh network, and they kind of see this. They kind of see that for things like social and messaging and stuff like that, going through hubs is a bit of an issue in terms of surveillance and all these other things. And so they basically designed a system where there simply is no common store, or there's no common coordination point. And you can just kind of set up this mesh and talk to people that you've connected to. Which seems like a very simple idea, but it's kind of like wild and different compared to the typical way that we look at networks. So thinking about all this stuff and thinking about how networks are formed and how that all kind of ties together into structuring, I had an idea a couple of years ago. I thought, gee, let's go and have a conference on decentralization. And I found the perfect place. It was going to be in Belforge, South Dakota, which is the geographic center of the United States. And I thought, yay. And actually, it isn't as awkward as it looks there. There really is a hotel there. There's a hotel, and there is a coffee shop. 5,000 people live there. So a couple restaurants. You got choices, And I thought, wouldn't this be great? So conference on decentralization in the geographic center of the United States. Turns out the decentralization community doesn't have as much humor in it as you would think, right? So it didn't really quite come together that way. But still, I think it would be a fun thing to do, to talk specifically about decentralization and how that affects structure of systems. But I had an insight a little while later, and it was essentially this. And I was trying to find a good language to go and speak it in. Graph theory. So a fully connected graph costs more than a minimum spanning tree. If you pay for the difference, you can have decentralization. Problem solved. Okay, now what does that mean? Right? So this is the insight I kind of had. And it's like, in computer science, you end up taking a bit of graph theory and digging into things. And what I thought of was this, that essentially the ideal situation for being able to sort of like having like a completely decentralized community is to go and sort of like have every point be able to talk to every single point, right? And you could do that, but the thing is, it's kind of like essentially you're going to have n-squared communication paths across the entire system. Now, if you want to have full connectivity, if you want to have connectivity of the graph, make sure something can get from one place to another, you can do it more easily by going and doing something like this. Just make sure that everybody is actually connected through somebody else. So you're kind of federating through something else. And so what that means is that quite often you're going to end up having some point in the network which basically acts as a mediator or an arbitrator between things. And so that's nice from a cost perspective, but it also has this downside, which is that essentially there's more power at that node than there is at the other nodes, because they can essentially surveil, they can turn things on, turn things off, all these other different things. But as I thought about this, I realized that essentially this is what goes on with most all systems. That essentially you can have decentralization, okay, but you have to be able to pay for the difference. And the difference is, the difference between a fully connected graph that's decentralized and something which is like a minimum spanning tree that allows you to go and sort of serve everybody, but still goes and has these points where you can intercept things or exert power or something crazy like that. So this is the idea. The difference is the cost of decentralization. And so this is one of those things where, it happens all the time. If you look at, the way the internet is connected, essentially you do have points that receive way, way, way more traffic than other points. You can even go further with this and you can say, let's look at nature, right? And essentially, in most biological organisms, you have like this hierarchical decomposition of arterial structure. So you have certain points which basically serve large areas, okay, but it's not like you have an even flow from every point to every point within the system. the economics of the system basically go and lead you to a structure where you have main arteries that go and break off into smaller branches and smaller branches and smaller branches until you get down to the point where you're able to serve the individual cells. So yeah, another quintessential area for this is routing for airlines, hub structure. How many people fly a lot? You know, you don't have to fly too much. You actually kind of notice this thing of like, I want to go from, say, you know, St. Louis to Austin, Texas, and I got to go through another airport, right? And you might say, oh, this is kind of ridiculous. Why do we have to do this sort of thing? But it really is just a function of cost, right? And a function of just trying to make a profit in a way. So Atlanta is one of the major airports in the world. It has more connections than anything else. And think about this from the point of view of being an airline. It's like if you are going to have a flight from, say, Orlando to Austin, you might be able to serve a certain amount of traffic that way, but if you can have a flight from Orlando to Atlanta, the onward connections are huge, and basically you're providing more value in a sense to the, you know, the people that might be your customers. Now there are alternatives to this, like Southwest famously has gone from, like, instead of hubs to hubs, it goes from secondary and tertiary airports, you know, back and forth just to sort of like fill in the gaps a bit. And that's an interesting strategy from a financial point of view. But this kind of structure, it's interesting to notice that this is natural and it's a consequence of seeking value and also going and having some preference in things. To kind of like move into other territory, if we talk about things like, say, inequality, okay, across the world, right, which has been a thing that we've been talking about for ages in the technical community and the broader community in the world politics. It's interesting to notice some things. I remember years ago talking to a friend of mine, and we were talking about inequality, and he had his iPhone on the table. And so I just started thinking for a second, it's like, wow, all my friends have iPhones too. I have an iPhone. And that morning I'd read, the number was a little bit lower than it is now, that Apple is sitting on $246 billion worth of cash, right? And you're kind of like, wow, talk about inequality. You know, essentially here's one company that has an incredible amount of cash on hand. But the thing that's kind of funny about this is that, how did that happen? It happened as a consequence of our choices, right? So we all kind of like said, hey, I want an Apple iPhone. So we chose to get an Apple iPhone. And you could be in a situation where you say, gee, you know, just out of goodness, I'm going to go and seek to go and get a, you know, a third-tier phone. But it's like, if you really want an iPhone, you're going to kind of sacrifice something to be able to go and do that sort of thing. So competitive markets lead to this sort of thing also. And you'll see this as well with, like, you know, income, you know, within the United States and also in many other countries. You just have this thing where basically wealth tends to concentrate, and it tends to happen as a side effect of people's choices about what they want to go and do. Now, could we solve this? You know, when you talk about system structuring, then one thing you could do is say, okay, well, let's set things up in such a way that we have many, many phone companies. And more than that, they can't just be having many phone companies. So you want to go and do something that sort of like make sure that they are all in very, very healthy competition with each other and no one particular company dominates. You could do that, right? And we could actually end up saying, okay, we're going to have an economy that's structured having many, many phone companies, maybe 15 or so. No single one dominates. There's lots more employment because each one of them happens to go and require more people for research and development and all these other things. That's a possibility too. And it's beyond me to go and say one is better than the other. But it's interesting to notice that these are really consequences of natural forces within systems. Anybody remember the internet from the 1990s? Okay, vaguely, yeah, okay. One of the things I remember was the dream of the World Wide Web, that basically it was going to be completely beautiful in the sense that anybody could put up a web page and everybody could sort of like have their voice heard and do all these different things and everything like that. And it's like, for the most part, that worked very well, but what do we have now? So we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have all these other things. And again, this is that same type of dynamic of saying, wow, oh, well, for me, I kind of held off on Facebook for ages until family got on it. Like, okay, well, I'll get on Facebook, right? And then you start to notice that you're getting more value from this particular thing. And as they raise their value proposition, everybody kind of gets dug into, hey, I'm going to be part of Facebook and doing this kind of thing. So the consequence of all this really is to go and point out that these kind of structuring things happen naturally within systems. And I guess in a way, if you sort of, I remember reading through my parents' old comic books years ago, there was one called Pogo. You ever hear of this little guy? It's a famous quip from him. We've met the enemy and he is us, right? So essentially, much of this structuring happens as a consequence of cost reduction. Cost reduction is there because we're seeking value, and it just tends to be a thing that happens across systems. Next thing though, let's go to organizations. We seem to have a big thing now for extremely flat organizational structure. We try to do this a lot within the industry. A friend of mine who started a startup a while ago is playing around with something called TEAL organizations, okay, which is a way of structuring things which is very flat, very distributed decision making, all these things. And it's wonderful. It's a nice way of going and approaching things. The thing I kind of wonder though is what's that like at scale? And I haven't really, reached out and sort of talked to people that are basically doing this thing of having very flat organizations at scale. Holacracy is another one of these things. But it's interesting to notice, why do we want to have that? Why do we want to have things extremely flat? And I think the primary reason for this is we just feel that it's going to be better in terms of decision making. It's better in making sure that all voices are heard and then we can go and do the things we need to do within an organization. It's less restrictive on the individual. And these are all powerful goals, but the question becomes, can we scale this kind of thing out in a massive way? What's that like? I was talking to a friend of mine, Bill Caputo, a while back, and he was relating to me an anecdote of something that he'd seen. He was working in an extremely flat organization, but it was based on teams. And the team had just no particular leader, or if there was a leader, the leader would step out of the way, let the team make their own decisions and coordinate with other teams. And there was a guy who joined his team who had project management experience. And they thought, okay, well, this is great because, as a developer, I don't really want to go to too many meetings. And he seems to enjoy this kind of stuff. Let's go ahead and send him over to go and talk to other teams and do this. And, the guy with the project management experience, his heart was in the right place and he was doing what he needed to do. And he would go over to other teams and sort of say, okay, well, what do you want? And they'd say, okay, this, and this. And he says, okay, hold it right there. And they'd run back to the team and go ahead and start talking to them and say, well, they want this and we're doing this kind of thing and stuff like this. And then he'd go back and doing this kind of thing, this coordination back and forth, until one day it's like he was back at the other team, and the other team people were saying, it's like, well, you're saying you're going to run back to these people over there. It's like, why don't what do we need you for, right? Why are you, if you don't have any authority in this situation, it's kind of like we're wasting time because we can go back and talk to them, right? And so that situation got itself resolved and everything. But the thing that's funny about this is that you can kind of see how structure evolves in organizations with this, right? It's like you have people who want to basically get their work done. There's a certain part of the work that they don't really necessarily want to do. Communication can be a bit painful for introverts, and I'm one of them, right? And you can be in a situation, oh, let me have somebody else do this. But then as you start to go and sort of, try to go and make things ease things through, you get into the situation where you are delegating authority to the person who's going to act as the intermediary. And that can work out very well if you have a very good manager, right? Or it can become something which is awkward and not very nice also. But it does seem to be one of those things that kind of happens at scale. Another thing I've kind of run into is the notion that essentially if we just have something like Slack, all this is solved, right? Essentially you can have everybody in the same Slack channel, and basically people, if they don't abuse it, questions get answered very quickly, and you can have much larger teams than you would have otherwise. Lots of ambient communication in order to go and make various different things surface within the organization and do things. And it does have all sorts of benefits, but I still feel there's this thing of like, it's kind of like Dunbar's Law, right? In Dunbar's Law, it's like the number of people you can keep track of kind of like maxes out at about 100 or so. And then you're in a situation of I can't recognize by face or by tag or something like this, these other people, so I don't feel as much affiliation with them. So we have to kind of like figure out how to separate things out. And essentially that's the thing of having, structure merge out of, the chaos of these things. There's a great paper from the 1970s by Joe Freeman, okay, called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Have you ever heard of this at all? Okay, it's a fascinating paper, and I encourage you to go back and read it. She was working in early feminism, women's rights and such in the 1970s, and basically doing political action with a bunch of other people. And the thing that they kind of got into was this sense of like, we don't want to have any structure because structure can be very awkward and it can basically lead to different power dynamics, and we don't want to have that kind of political maneuvering within organizations. So they decided to be structuralists in many different areas. But the thing she found based upon experience and talking to people and seeing what was happening is that the more structuralist a particular organization became, the more you had an informal structure. And quite often the informal structures could be just as awkward and painful for people as the ones which are more formalized. So there is this odd thing that essentially we can try to avoid structure, but the thing is we do tend to need to have it. And it does tend to sort of like happen naturally within systems. So yeah, essentially if you want to go and have a system with massive amounts of free communication between places, you are going to reach a limit at some point where you're going to want to delegate things through, and then you end up having something which is more structured than you might expect to have. Now, it's funny when you look at this, you say, okay, wow, you know, I'm kind of giving you a bunch of constraints in a way, or things that seem to be things you should be aware of when you're looking at structuring across different systems. But it's nice to kind of notice places where you're able to sort of like successfully evade those a little bit. So have you ever heard of a company called VioWeb at all? Okay, it's one you should probably know historically. It was the first web-based company. It was developed by Paul Graham, who was the founder of Y Combinator, Hacker News, all these other things years ago. And him and some college friends basically started this business to allow you to go and sort of build an e-commerce, you know, store on the internet, which was a completely novel, you know, idea at the time. The web was very, very young at the time. You know, as an aside, they built the entire system in Lisp just because they could. Eventually ended up going and selling this product to Yahoo as Yahoo stores, and basically went on to, you know, be quite successful for its time. The thing that was really amazing to me when I first read about this was the anecdotes that he had about what it was like to be in that kind of a startup, which was really, I think, just him and two other people at the time. And he would talk about these situations where he's basically talking to somebody like a sales call and then also coding with his right hand, right? And I thought, that's kind of amazing. It's like, it's weird that we can do this thing, this multitasking thing in a way of like, you know, I'm not a complete business person, but I can do business. I may not be a complete developer, but I can do a bit of development also. One of the anecdotes in there, which I thought was amazing, was they actually would have customers call in and say, you know, there's really something wrong with my store. You go to the upper right-hand corner and I click on this, nothing really happens. And he would be on the phone and he would go and sort of like open the running image of the thing, correct the problem, and then basically tell the person, it's like, I don't see anything. It's kind of like it works, right? And just sort of correct the problem immediately. So, you know, full path, you can actually do this sort of thing. But it's funny to see what happens with organizations in general. That isn't really viable for very long, right? To have, you know, 4 or 5 people just know how to do everything. So the typical thing that happens is economies of scale, cost reduction. We basically go and hire somebody whose job is, say, HR, whose job is accounting, and basically have them do those things because those are the things that we don't care to do. And we end up going and building this structure naturally within the context of systems. And I don't know, I always kind of wonder with this is like, can we keep some of this? Can we basically sort of scale up and then kind of maintain enough awareness that we don't have to go and build too much structure? Structure can kind of get in our way as we move forward with things. And I think we're really, you know, in an open space with this in organizations. I think the whole thing that's happening architecturally with like monoliths and microservices is nice. And, you know, it doesn't take too long talking to people that are doing microservices to go and realize that they've got problems too. And so there's no perfect answer with these things. It's really just a matter of going and saying what structure is appropriate at different scales. So I really feel that structure is inevitable at scale. And it also needs to be different at different scales. And this is, I think, a very hard lesson for us. I think the hardest thing with this, recognizing this sort of thing, is that we kind of know in the back of our minds that this is liable to be destructive, right? And it's definitely true in the case of architecture and software. Transitioning from like a monolith to microservices is, you know, it's a big deal. And it basically goes and takes a lot of time and effort to do these sorts of things. And in the back of your mind, you'll say, gee, if we just started that way before, things might be better. But I think the scale issue is much the same way. And much the same way as well, I think with organizational structure, it's the same type of thing. With organizations, you know, different structures work at different scales. And I think we should be really suspicious of any particular process that touts being scale invariant, because it just doesn't seem like the world works that way. Okay? When you are working in a 6 to 12 person team, there's a lot of ceremony you don't need. It's totally superfluous. No need to do that sort of thing. As you add more people, you need to go and get everybody together and figure out what's going to work at this particular scale. Spotify model, it's great. At some point, it's going to break down, right? Or in different situations or contexts, it might break down. It's just something we need to be really aware of. So yeah, I think this is the main thing, is that we just need to go and recognize that, you know, getting used to reorganizing is powerful for us. We have to recognize that we need to do this at different scales, and it's a very healthy thing to do. I think the other thing to go and mention, I don't have a slide for this, is that, you know, because there are certain inevitable side effects of scaling, another option as well is to go and say, look, let's just not scale, all right? And this is counter to a lot of what we kind of hope for in the industry. There's the notion of like, okay, we start something up, and then basically as a founder, we hope to go and sort of sell it, make a lot of money, move on. Many people go and get into the industry with hopes of going and sort of like cashing out in particular things. The alternative is to go and say, look, you know, here's a niche business that I have, and I am going to choose not to grow it past a certain point. And it's not because I don't want this to be successful and vital and helpful to people and make lots of money and all these other things. It's because when I know that once I get to a different scale, it's going to be a different thing. And maybe I don't want it to be something at that scale. And that's a viable choice. And I do see people doing this periodically. They have a small company, they kind of like, they get it big enough to weather storms, and then they're kind of happy with it being what it is, move on, create another company, that kind of thing. Some of these companies may fall apart at some point because they don't have the benefit of being huge, but that's okay. And then at that point, we really have the benefit of having diversity across the entire, you know, economic ecosystem in a way, where you have some big companies and you have lots of small companies, and, you know, that's okay. So the key thing with this is just recognizing the scale means something, and we can't walk around believing that it just doesn't matter. And once we're aware of this, we have tons of choices. And so I'm just going to kind of like open this up to you, questions and answers, and see what you think. Any thoughts?
I didn't know there was a test at the end.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Okay, and I think there's a microphone coming past, but, you know, okay, cool. Let's go ahead and do it that way. It'll be easier to.
Really thought-provoking talk. Thanks. I was wondering, are you aware of any sort of body of research or evidence that talks about different organizational structures that have been successful at particular scales?
Not really, no. And I, to be perfectly honest, I haven't dug deep into organizational literature for these things. I see things that become popularized, and I, you know, various different things, and things are kind of forwarded to me. But I haven't really done a search for appropriateness of scale for particular different organizations, the organizational structuring. If anybody has anything like that, I'd love to see it. But I think there's something there, you know. So, any other thoughts, questions? Okay.
I think you mentioned this, but I know Zappos, you know, they made this transition to holacracy probably a couple of years ago now, and they've been doing it for a while. I mean, how do you think that works? I mean, Zappos clearly is a successful, you know, business, but holacracy seems like a very chaotic thing to practice, and I kind of wonder if it plays out sort of like that project manager story that you told, where people kind of, you know, gravitate towards certain roles, and it ends up being something that's kind of structured, even though, you know, you're not supposed to have managers and things like that.
So this is just wild speculation, because I've never visited a company doing holacracy. I've only read about it. From a systems point of view, I agree with you that there is structure there. The person who wrote the book about this, you know, talks about circles and all these other things that kind of give you a bit of structure. I think one of the things that's really kind of rough in general when you're talking about organizational structuring and stuff along these lines is company life cycle and company market condition. It's been kind of like a thing which has really opened my eyes over the years being a consultant in the software development industry, is to realize how many things don't matter to success, right? Some things are kind of like, okay, well, you can do this or you can do this, and it doesn't matter to success, you can be successful anyway. And that actually happens with a lot of software. You can have some companies with lousy software, yet they're wildly successful, and actually getting people to try to improve software is tough because it's like, hey, it's working, right? That kind of thing. So I think the same thing is like with Zappos. You know, it's like, you know, I don't know. It could very well be that that is a viable model across many different fields, different market conditions. I wonder how well it works in a very competitive market. I don't know, you know. And so it'd be interesting to see. If anybody has stories about that, it'd be great to hear them too. Okay.
Hi, just wanted to comment or really mention, it was interesting to see the early model with the network diagram about how you have very powerful pipelines or points in the thing. And when I think about my organization and their attempts at the scale, it almost seems like you need those powerful points to stay. So like if you try to scale your product across multiple teams, you lose that ownership or the power of the silo in that product. And if you try to make, you know, product A behave just like product B in terms of scaling it, you kind of lose the power of whatever product A or product B was.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm going to give you 2 points of reference, which I think are kind of funny. Anybody's aware of the comedian John Cleese from Monty Python? Right. Since I read lots of stuff, I read this book that was written by him and his therapist back in the 1990s or something like that. And it was really this entire thing of like, how do things work in the world and stuff like that. And one of the things they talked about as an issue of organization is that I think the psychologist was saying, at least from what he'd seen of healthy organizations, there's a lot of distributed decision making, but there's kind of a person or an executive team that kind of hangs back and says, okay, well, this is fine, but you know what, we're here for emergencies. If we're trying to go and do something, we will step in, we will make some decisions, and that's okay. But you know, our goal is to go and basically make sure that everybody grows and everything is good in this organization. And this reminds me of something I had a conversation about 2 years ago with the late Peter Hitchens, Zero MQ, who unfortunately died last year. And he, as I was getting into decentralization, some friends of mine were saying, you need to talk to Peter. And I talked to him in a conference in Lithuania. And I was kind of like just, you know, nailing at him about how he was talking about how completely decentralized Zero MQ was. But he did sort of say, it's like, yeah, there are me and a couple of the other founders, and we will step in if there's a problem, right? So there's this thing. I think that you need to go and have a balance, and basically when there are times of reorganization or massive change, having people who can act as change agents is a pretty powerful thing. The thing that I just want to kind of follow that up with is that I tend to be a person who believes that whenever we go all in one direction, we should ask ourselves, well, what's the other direction like also, right? And why are we making this choice? And I think that there's this thing that we try to move towards extremely flat organizations, and they have benefits and liabilities. So it's probably worth us going and looking at all different ways of structuring things and from a zero judgment point of view, and just sort of say, look, you know, benefits and liabilities, what works best for us at this point in time, you know? So, yeah.
It's interesting to have you present this to give us a chance to sit and ponder it, right? Because I'm sure some of us have experiences with it. The experiences I've had with such things are, one, in healthcare, in education, in the training of physicians. In other words, it's an area where mentoring is key and integral. And through some studies way back, we learned very quickly that it does not scale because of the human aspect of mentoring. In technology, one area where I personally had experience was within AEC, architecture, engineering, and construction, in that vertical market with project management software. And when all the drawings started appearing on the computer, the managers lost their ability to walk around with their coffee at 4:30 in the afternoon and just assess the progress on the project. They couldn't see the drawings. And technology adjusted to that with various means in searches. So I think that the interesting takeaway for us as software developers is in pondering the work we do and what are the possible effects, how are we able to acknowledge that this happens. And so if you take a tool like Slack, obviously it's affected our ability to communicate and so forth. But it's interesting. I appreciate being able to sit here and draw these connections to previous experiences. I think it's very real. I think it's organizations like my own company and so forth. Yes, I acknowledge it, but I don't address it enough. I think that's my personal takeaway.
I think half of this is basically just knowing about this stuff, understanding these systemic effects. And you know, every time you understand some systemic effect, then you know that you've got some possible design parameter. And organizations are designed, right, where they're kind of left to design themselves. And you just have to basically sort of be aware of what the possibilities are, or just the forces enough to be able to go and say, gee, what if I do this, right? One of the things I talk about periodically is Conway's Law in software development, where the notion that software tends to kind of like match the structure of the teams producing it. And it's interesting to notice that you can, with that, once you kind of notice that, you can actually apply it as a technique. You can say, gee, I want to have some separation, some module separation in this software. I want to have two different teams work on the two different pieces. And because of the fact that there's less communication between the teams, you end up having a module boundary almost like it emerges in a way. And so you can basically go ahead and change organizations in order to go and sort of create the forces necessary to go and achieve particular ends. But this it has to work within the constraints of, there's a lot of inertia also. So you can try to change structure in order to go and achieve different ends, but because change can be slow, you may not go and get the effect that you want over until a long period of time has elapsed. So yeah, being aware gives us more possibilities. I guess that's the summary. So, okay.
So you've talked about how the structures need to be different at different scales. How do you think this applies to code as well, to our code style being different at different levels of abstraction?
Yeah, it's interesting with this because we've been after modularity for ages within software development, and we tend to not do it very well, right? When microservices first came around, I remember writing up saying, wow, software developers seem to be adept at breaking encapsulation no matter what we do, actually going and having services written in different languages and going across web protocols is probably enough to go and really force dependencies to break in a system, right? I think that there's necessary grain to software development because of our cognitive limitations. We need to be able to go and look at one particular piece in isolation and know how it works, know how it fits to other pieces that we understand in order to go and get the particular outcomes that we want. So I think a lot of this is natural. It's also something which has come up over the decades in software development. The things that we see as design principles are really all about going and sort of arriving at appropriate scale for human comprehension and for maintenance and all these different things. I think it's kind of funny because now object orientation is kind of on the bad list, right? Or it's like it's been around for ages. People still use it, it's great, but yay, functional is the big thing. But we might be just readjusting scale with this. I remember like Alan Kay back in the early days used a biological metaphor for classes, like objects, and he basically said this is all about messaging between different objects like you would message through chemicals across cells. And it's interesting that that's really more like what we do with asynchronous protocols and services than what we have done historically with objects. I guess one last piece to go and throw with this is that biology is a great place to look for things because it's a system that's been growing for millions and millions of years, and it's arrived at certain solutions, and we can leverage a lot of that information. So is that too much?
So how do you scale, for instance, a Slack channel? Because what works well for 20 people isn't working at all for 200. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, it works again for 2,000. So how do you scale those kinds of processes?
I think the big thing to ask is not how do we scale this. The big thing to ask is how do we achieve the end we want to achieve without necessarily scaling something. Right? So the thing is, you're talking about like there's this donut hole, there's like this dead space with Slack where it works well locally, but also works for very big groups of people, but the center spot becomes really tough. And I tend to feel that in most systems, when you notice a force like that, it's like you can go and say, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to fix it. Or you can go and say, wow, that's a thing, isn't it? And then you can say, well, gee, if that middle space isn't really being served well, what can I basically do to go and serve the middle space? And it may not even be automated at all. It could be just something about how you organize things internally within your organization to deal with things that happen at that particular scale. So, it's like you can fight nature a lot, right? And you can win a lot of the times, but sometimes you have to pick your battles and say, wait, this isn't quite, what's the other thing we can do? Being able to switch gears is a very powerful thing to do.
So. Thank you for a great talk. Could you maybe comment a little bit on how important you think human factors are to this problem of scalability. For example, emotions or greed, like things like that. Like I saw the picture of the plant leaf, and that was really, I think thought-provoking, because you don't have that element to it. So I just wondered if you have any comments about that.
I have I'm formulating some opinions about this, which I think go a little bit against the grain. That I think that a lot of times we look at local bad actors, and this might be like more of the older Japanese production point of view. It's like it's the system that's broken, not the people, that kind of thing. So I think it's easy for us to go and look and say, oh, here's a person who's being really greedy and stuff like that. And that does happen, but that's also a manifestation of the way a system is structured at times. Right? So as you said, the leaf has the same type of structuring. The management scenario I talked about, where you have two teams and the person who's acting as a manager, I've seen brilliant managers, and I've also seen atrocious ones. And I think that one of the things that I find myself thinking about so much these days is how much we want flat organizations because we're scared of people getting power that shouldn't have it, right? And that means that we sort of thinking that having people in these particular positions can be inherently bad, and it can be good also, right? You just need the right people, that kind of thing. So I think there's this thing that it's like the structure can lead to bad outcomes because people get perverse incentives. Maybe you go and sort of change the incentives and change the reporting and stuff like that so that you can still, get a structure that works well, but without that kind of stuff, right? I realize I went over the map there, but it's just stream of consciousness.
So my question follows on with that very tightly, right? So most of the communication is invisible. So it's not like we can count packet transfers and things between people.
Except in Slack.
Except in Slack. Until it becomes electronic, and then it becomes somewhat visible. So I'm trying to phrase this right. So there's some kind of connection between that, right? It's invisible to begin with. And in a communication network, some nodes have more power, more moderating ability, more involvement in communication than others. So, talk about an organization. Often they want to designate and manage what those points of those nodes of power are, but they really can't see what the nodes of power currently are. So what do you see in the conflict in organizations between the informal communication structure and the official communication structure? And do you see that as a problem?
I think that to the degree that they are deeply misaligned or basically serve different functions, it's problematic. And this is just observation. I think that you might look at this and say, hey, let's go and get rid of the informal power structure entirely. And that's a mistake because it's not going to happen. And from Joe Freeman's tyranny of structurelessness, you can see that basically going and saying, hey, let's get rid of the formal structure and just having the informal one, that has its downsides also. So the big question, I think, or the big issue, I think, is to go and actually be aware enough of the informal structure that you can always check it for alignment against the formal structure that you have. And I don't know enough about this to go and basically say whether they should be always in alignment or something like this. I think that they can actually serve slightly different functions and have different concerns and still end up going and serving the entire whole of the organization. So, yeah.
Just had a quick comment, and if you're working in an organization where it's a core tenet that product teams own their product end-to-end production, what I've found is that the design of your business organization tends to map to the design of your architecture. So the boundaries of those products tend to define the teams that own those products. Mm-hmm. And so as you go from a monolith to a microservices architecture, and the number of products increases and the boundaries increases, in a world where you still want to have a single team owning something end to end, you end up having to decompose the organization in a similar way. So.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation. And I think, I guess the one other big takeaway with this is that there's no one right answer, right? In all of design, you have, trade-offs. And one of the things I loved about the older patterns literature was that basically for every pattern that they outlined, they said, okay, here's this thing, here are the forces, you apply the pattern, and you have these consequences. And consequences could be positive or negative depending upon your context. So yeah, product organization can be great It can allow more nimble things to be more nimble architecturally, but there's also like coordination work that needs to happen above that in order to go and sort of like allow you to go and make decisions that impact the overall architecture. And that's just a trade-off. And that's just, you know, that's the way it is. So, yeah.
So there may not be any right answer, but do you think there are any principles that work at different size and scale, some universal truths?
Universal truths. I don't know. I think I tend to take a bigger point of view with this sometimes too, that I do have a preference for smaller organizations, but you know, there's the problem with small organizations is that they're not as great at surviving as bigger organizations in many cases, and bigger organizations tend to have life cycles also, right? They, you know, and I think from what I've read in business literature, it has been accelerating that, you know, organizations will grow very, very big and then kind of fall apart, and that might just be a side effect of technological change. I think overall, the thing that I kind of hope for with this is that we're aware of all these different things, and you get to make choices with this, and then we end up having enough difference across the entire economy. Here's the funny thing, right? So I speak at a lot of conferences, and it's funny the different questions you get from different people. The few times I've spoken at universities, you get to tell them something a little bit different than you tell people at conferences sometimes. And that is like, okay, you're just about to go and enter the world of work. The first place you work, it's not all like that. Make sure you move around and go to different places. Because, you know, it's kind of tragic to basically meet people 7 or 8 years into their career who basically believe the entire world of software development is this one particular way. And so I believe that having, you know, very diverse cultures and experiences across the industry is powerful. You can have different business models, all these different things. So the meta thing is to go and basically say that, you know, nothing is completely perfect this way, but you have a choice about what kind of an organization you build. And yeah, different benefits and liabilities. That's the meta principle for this, I think. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? Okay, thank you very much.